Hello everyone and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Jeanne Lambert as today's presenter. Jeanne is series editor of Final Draft, an academic writing series by Cambridge University Press. She has 20 years of ESL classroom experience, teacher training experience and materials writing experience. She's taught at Columbia University, City University of New York and the New School, specializing in academic writing and English for academic purposes. She's worked as an ESL Methods Practicum instructor and currently teaches academic writing at the New School. So, over to Jeanne.
Thank you, Alistair, and welcome everyone to Plagiarism, Why Students Do It and How You Can Help. Thank you so much for attending. As Alistair mentioned, I've been teaching for 20 years, but it's only been in the last 6 or so years that I've seen a dramatic increase in plagiarism in my own classrooms. When I started dealing with it regularly, I realized I had to adjust my teaching practice to address the issue. So I've been experimenting and trying to perfect my own pedagogy over the last 5 or so years, and I'm here today to share those experiences and share some of my reading of the research on the issue. My main goal today is to provide some concrete solutions and ideas for your teaching practice around this issue. Okay, let's start off by looking at the poll question results. I'm curious to see if your responses match my own. I asked this question because of the dramatic increases in my class that I just mentioned. Oh, interesting results. You can see here that we have a majority of those that responded in the category of 1 to 2 instances, and closely following that, 3 to 4 instances, but also a solid number of participants that are saying more. I think these results show why we needed the webinar today, don't you? I think we're dealing with it pretty regularly, and I wonder if we delve deeper into the instances that you're reporting now, and include a wide range of examples, maybe some cases that we don't consider clear-cut cases, if that number would even increase. This semester I had 5 cases, and 2 required a formal process, which I can talk a little bit about later. But I think these poll results are very interesting. I think that we'll have an interesting webinar today in talking about how to avoid plagiarism. Okay. Let me now briefly review the agenda for the rest of the webinar. First, I'll talk about L2 issues in plagiarism, then some reasons students plagiarize. I'll present some key research on plagiarism, offer some approaches and solutions, and then time for Q&A. Most of this webinar will focus on approaches and solutions. I want it to be a practical experience, one where you walk away with a lot of ideas and activities for what you can do. You, of course, do not have to use all of the solutions. Some may work better for you than others, but I want you to have a number of strategies to consider. Okay, so L2 issues in plagiarism. Why is this issue so pressing? Why have a webinar? Well, some of the issues are quite challenging. First, dealing with plagiarism is often negative, time-consuming, and bureaucratic for the student and the teacher, but perhaps more for the teacher. I think that's probably true. I think back to a case I had at the end of the term where a student plagiarized her out-of-class final paper. It was not a gray area case. She had cut and pasted a number of paragraphs from 2 online magazines alongside of some of her own original writing. This case set off a bureaucratic process that involved communication with my director, with my students' advisors, with messages to the student herself, and it ended with a meeting with the student, a rewrite of the paper, another round of grading, and then writing a detailed report of that meeting and the resolution, and more. I'm not going to give you the full recounting, but all told, I probably spent 4 hours dealing with this one case. With just one case, you can put in many hours and a lot of mental energy. I've thought about the number of hours I put into dealing with this issue each term, and if I multiply the number of cases I'm seeing each term times the number of hours to address them, And if they keep happening at the same rate, I'll have spent hundreds of hours on this over the years. So a lot of my time, your time, is taken up with it. And let's face it, it's not the most fun thing to address. I always try to make it a learning experience for the student, but the student is still somewhat uncomfortable, and I'd rather spend my time helping the student improve their writing in the first place. So this is an issue for us teachers in terms of time and bureaucracy for sure. And the problem persists despite detection software like Turnitin. We are perhaps better at detecting, but not necessarily better at preventing. But perhaps the most pressing issue of all is a pedagogical problem. Because if a student plagiarizes, he or she is not writing, and therefore not improving. And that's the goal of our courses. We are here to help our students improve and meet their academic goals. And the administration is looking for our students to improve as well. So even if just a handful of students plagiarize each term in each class in an EAP program, that's a significant fraction of the program not improving. I'm concerned about that. These are just some of the issues. Perhaps some others will come up during the Q&A. But what are some of the reasons students plagiarize? I think it's important to consider why students plagiarize in the first place so we can address the issue in effective ways. We know that some students plagiarize as a shortcut or they just don't want to do the work. I had one student say after plagiarizing a Swedish PhD candidate's dissertation that they found online by saying, quote, "I was busy." Okay, but I think many more students do it for other reasons than simply cheating or using a shortcut. One issue is that students need greater language skills in order to avoid plagiarism. They need to be skilled readers and writers to do the work we are asking them to do college-level work. They also need strong research and note-taking skills. These are all areas where our students are still developing. Then there's the lack of awareness of what constitutes plagiarism. And I think this is a big issue, and I'm going to touch upon this in the solutions section. Each term I do an activity with students where I ask them to determine if passages constitute plagiarism, and invariably a majority do not get the correct answers. We need more awareness raising around the issue. I strongly believe many of our students are unaware of what constitutes plagiarism. And our students are not fully initiated into the academic discourse community. They do not yet have a full awareness or mastery of expert opinion and attribution. It's our job to help them with this. Then there's the pressure associated with high-stakes courses and exams. Students, as you know, feel pressure to pass writing exams in order to move quickly out of ESL and into college, or simply to move to the next level of ESL. There's an incentive there for plagiarism. Some argue that there's a cultural factor, but there's real disagreement about this in the L2 literature on plagiarism. There are a number of studies in particular that show that there is little difference in attribution practices between L1 and L2 students. This does not mean it's not a factor at all, but again, there is disagreement in the literature. And when I met with my student that plagiarized her final paper, she started off by saying that in her country she feels it's okay to use someone else's words. But by the end of our meeting, she admitted it was mostly about having difficulty with writing. And I think that's the most plausible explanation for why most students plagiarize. And I didn't add this one to the list, but I can say that anecdotally, many of my lower level students who have plagiarized have said something along the lines of, "The writing I found online is better than mine." Have you heard that before? It's almost as if they want to please me by turning in something that is, quote unquote good. Again, I've found that mostly with the lower level students, but I have heard that in response to plagiarism. Okay, I'd like to turn now to a key concept in the literature on plagiarism. Rebecca Moore Howard from Syracuse University initially introduced the concept of patch writing in 1992. In a nutshell, she wrote that she believed students were being labeled plagiarist even though they were not committing plagiarism. In particular, she took issue with a definition of plagiarism that labeled paraphrasing too closely to the original as an instance of plagiarism. She defines this paraphrasing too closely as patch writing, which is, quote, copying from a source text and then deleting some words, altering grammatical structures, or plugging in one-for-one synonym substitutes. She distinguishes patch writing from simply borrowing one's words without documenting the source. She has continued to contribute to the literature on the subject and believes there is value in patch writing as a composing strategy for developing writers. She sees this as, quote, entry-level manipulation of new ideas and vocabulary. Furthermore, she believes that while students do need practice with the technical skills of attribution, they very much need to engage in language experimentation like patch writing. In her own courses with instances of plagiarism, she began to think of the borrowing she saw as a way to, quote, gain membership in a new culture, the academic culture. Moore was teaching L1 students, but I think this concept is useful for us to consider. It can help us frame our L2 students' experience also. They too are attempting to gain membership in a new culture, and they too are at an entry-level point with academic language. I don't think we have to agree or disagree today with patch writing or paraphrasing too closely as plagiarism or not. The larger issue Moore wants to draw attention to is the value of patch writing as a composing strategy for developmental writers. Okay. I've seen my students use patch writing quite a bit, and not just when trying to paraphrase an author's words, but when trying to imitate structures they found. Students at this stage of writing development are trying to adopt the academic voice we are asking them to adopt, and perhaps patch writing is a natural result of that. Given this, perhaps we should be explicit with students about the concept of patch writing. Perhaps with advanced level students, for example, we can show students a sample of patch writing of a summary or paraphrase sentence, and then a more advanced version, where the writer is able to use more of his or her own words or ideas to recast the original. In other words, contrasting a patch-written version with a more mature version in order to help students understand more about plagiarism, but also how to write a more advanced paraphrase. I'm giving you a preview here of the solutions section. I think this idea of patch writing is an interesting pedagogical opportunity. Maybe we could even consider having our students deliberately write a patch-written version of their own and then try to rewrite a more sophisticated version. Perhaps there would be pedagogical value in that process. And a final thought on this concept of patch writing, and I recommend that you read Moore's work on this, very interesting. Perhaps our own teaching of paraphrasing misleads students into thinking they can use synonyms and make minor changes in language when not paraphrasing. I'm not certain that this is the case, but it's something to consider, and perhaps something we could discuss more in the Q&A. Okay, let's shift somewhat to more approaches and solutions for our teaching practice. I think in light of the discussion of patch writing and how students are struggling to find their academic voice, it's important to have an overall approach that is about skills rather than simply about academic integrity. I try to adopt the following overall approaches in my classroom. First, regular practice for avoiding plagiarism. In the past, I talked about plagiarism at the start of the term and had students sign an academic integrity pledge. Then the issue didn't come up again until I worked on paraphrasing. I don't know if that was your pattern as well, but that's roughly 2 exposures to the issue. When I started seeing increased plagiarism in my classes, I realized that was not enough. That was clear. I had to weave in more regular practice and more discussion of the issue. I also needed to emphasize skill building over an academic problem to be solved. In this way, I focus on the tools needed to avoid plagiarism, which I see as a positive approach, as opposed to the, don't commit an academic crime approach, which I view as negative and less helpful. That's not to say that we shouldn't alert students to our institution's policies around plagiarism, but that isn't what frames my approach. I want to connect avoiding plagiarism to academic norms in a comprehensive way. Avoiding plagiarism is not about avoiding an academic crime. It's about being part of a discourse community. It's about being in the know. It's about being more expert in the areas of writing and attribution. So these approaches frame my curriculum around the issue. Now let's shift from overall approaches to some concrete solutions. I found that one important teaching practice for avoiding plagiarism is to be very careful when choosing the level of text I ask students to paraphrase or summarize. Why is this? Because if a text is too challenging for a student to read and understand, there is an incentive to plagiarize, or at a minimum, there is added frustration, which I believe impacts motivation. In Rebecca Moore Howard's 1992 article on patch writing, she theorized as to why her students employed this technique. She guessed that it might be because the text she was having students summarize were highly challenging. She guessed this because she knew of another group of students that summarized a less challenging narrative text, and with those students there were far fewer instances of plagiarism. But we also have research that confirms Moore's educated guess. Miguel Roig, professor of psychology at St. John's University here in New York, conducted 2 studies on plagiarism when paraphrasing in 1999. His first study of 215 undergraduates set out to find if students understood that to paraphrase, one has to substantially modify the original passage. In this study, he gave a 2-sentence text to paraphrase that had a 15.6 grade score using the Flesch-Kincaid readability test. Many of you are likely familiar with the Flesch-Kincaid readability calculator, which you can access online and which is used in many fields to determine text complexity. Perhaps some of you have even used it to determine if a text is too complex for your students. So Roig used this text with a grade level of 15.6 and found that roughly 46% of paraphrased responses were plagiarized. Wow, that's high. Think about that for a minute. Almost half plagiarized. But he also found that in the unplagiarized responses, many of the students had lost the author's meaning. That finding in particular led him to conduct a second study using a much lower level text. In the second study, he had roughly the same number of undergraduate participants from the same university, and he also used a 2-sentence text. But this new text had a Flesch-Kincaid readability score of 11.2. He found a dramatic decrease in the instances of plagiarism. Here, only 15% of the responses were plagiarized. 15%. Dramatic decrease. His initial conclusions, based on his 2 studies, are that when college students are faced with highly challenging texts, their notion of what constitutes a substantial modification of an original passage loosens. In other words, faced with a challenge, they fall back on using more of the original words of the author. I have to say, this confirms my own experience with students in paraphrasing. I found that my students have a harder time using their own words when the texts are more challenging. So, what can we glean for L2 teaching practice from Moore's guess and Roig's research conclusions? When I learned of this research, I started changing the text I use for paraphrasing practice. I became more careful about my choices in terms of text level. Now I always make sure to choose texts that are right at the level, not a level up, or often even a level or 2 lower for summarizing and paraphrasing practice. Not reading practice, writing practice. Some may say that this does not provide students with what they will really encounter in college. And while, of course, I agree that students will be faced with paraphrasing a range of texts outside of our classes, my aim is to help my students build foundational skills. And I don't see the usefulness of providing more complex texts for this practice, especially if it leads to over-reliance on the author's original words, or as Moore would call it, patch writing. In other words, I want to build my students' skills and their confidence in their ability to paraphrase. I find that giving them a text that they can understand leads to more mastery in paraphrasing, and that leads to more motivation. My hope for all of my students is that this practice leads them in the future to feel more confident about tackling various texts. Okay, another way to help students with this issue of challenging texts is to explore the text fully to ensure there's a complete understanding. I think it's important also to, just a moment, I'm sorry, I'm going to regroup. We should always have the students read the original more than once. This can be over several class sessions. In fact, it's ideal for this to take place over several class sessions. This can ensure that students understand what they're reading before they paraphrase. For example, you might give a passage for reading homework, and then when you meet the next time in class, have ample discussion to check on the understanding before students summarize or paraphrase. I found that this also models for students the amount of time needed to digest a text. I find that students are often misguided about how long it takes to read and understand. Perhaps you've had that experience too. Maybe you've had the experience where you ask students if they understood the reading and everyone is shaking their head yes, and then you start the discussion and it's clear that they have not, right? I've also had success with helping students to understand texts and to paraphrase them by asking them to do an oral summary in groups or pairs, and then sharing their summaries with the class. By the end of the sharing and with my facilitating, the class comes to a consensus on the meaning. Then I find they are ready to write. All of these solutions are scaffolding for the very difficult task I am asking them to undertake. So to wrap up this solution, I would just urge you to always look at the text you are asking students to paraphrase. Is it a text that will lead to a moment of success for the student? That's what guides my approach. Also, sometimes I'll try to do a quick paraphrase myself of a text to see how it goes, before I ask students to paraphrase. And there have been passages where I'm like, okay, this is taking some real effort here, and I'm a writer and an editor, and I've chosen to teach writing as an area of specialty, so that's a flag for me. For me, it's very important to try to do what I'm asking my students to do from time to time. It's another check on whether the task is realistic. Okay, on to solution 2. Another important solution for helping students avoid plagiarism is careful note-taking practice. Focusing on note-taking also has the side benefit of helping students examine text closely, which I just discussed in solution 1. Let's take a look at how you can create a lesson for note-taking. You can start off by helping students understand the rationale for careful note-taking. Here in the final draft example, there was a question and answer format for that, and it's done to offer a non-threatening approach to the topic of avoiding plagiarism. You can easily replicate this for your own classes. Then you can give students the steps needed for effective note-taking. Then ask students to analyze sample notes. I find that this step, for most of my activities, is so central. Whether it's analyzing a sample of a student summary or here, analysis of notes, I find showing samples of what I'm asking the students to do helps students conceptualize what I'm asking. And again, teaching careful note-taking has an additional benefit. It encourages focus and careful reading, two things I find my students struggle with. After you do an activity like this, you can assign a reading and have them take careful notes. They could then turn those notes in for your review or share them with a partner, or they could be used in a range of tasks. It's important to have, I think, a real academic task related to their note-taking. Okay, now to solution 3. Another way I think we can possibly help reduce instances of plagiarism is to bring even the lower levels into the discussion about plagiarism. This initiates all students in EAP programs into the academic discourse community. If we wait and only address it with the most advanced levels, we may miss an opportunity to give students more time to digest the issues. And you can do different kinds of activities targeted for the lower levels. If you are working with beginning or low intermediate students, you can, for example, help them recognize plagiarism. Here's an example from Final Draft Book 2, which is for low intermediate students. You could easily prepare a lesson like this, where you provide students with an original passage and different plagiarized versions and have them identify the various issues. Helping students recognize plagiarism at this level allows you to open the discussion about the topic and give students more exposure. Again, these skills and ideas take time to develop and digest. Another possible lesson for the lower levels is to simply focus on the concept of a source in writing. Just defining what a source is helps students understand a key concept in academic writing. It's a preview for future work, scaffolding as we say. And then, as shown here in Final Draft Book 2, you can have students explore where they could find a credible source, and then do noticing and practice activities. Again, with this approach, we are bringing more students into important academic discussions, but not overburdening them with higher level materials or activities. And if students are in an EAP program, they do intend to go to college at some point, and starting early with these key discussions seems useful and even necessary. Okay, to go back to recognizing plagiarism, but this time for all levels, I think it's critical to use positive and engaging activities for this. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, I think we need more focus on recognizing plagiarism. For the last 5 or so years, I've had my students review 12 scenarios and ask them to choose if they constitute plagiarism or not. Only 2 are not instances of plagiarism, by the way. But without fail, a majority of my students do not get the correct answers. This confirms my perception that many students do not understand what constitutes plagiarism, and there's also research that confirms this. How can we help this? How can we address it in a positive, engaging way? You can certainly replicate my scenarios activity. I ask students to do this in pairs, and each time I find they like the game aspect of it, trying to get all the right answers. And there are a lot of laughs, which helps with the positive approach. I throw an example of self-plagiarism, and that always shocks them. How can you plagiarize yourself, they proclaim. And it's not that I want to focus so much on self-plagiarism, but I want to engage them overall, and I want to introduce some fun to what I think we can all agree is not considered a fun topic. You can also have students write definitions of plagiarism and explore them in class. Definition writing is useful in and of itself. We have to do it a lot in academic writing. But I've done this definition of plagiarism activity a number of times and found that students have to dramatically alter their original definitions. They deepen their understanding of plagiarism through writing. Many start off with just stealing words or taking another's ideas. But with more research and revision, they see that it's pretty complicated, and their definitions grow in length. And that opens the door for discussion. Another possibility is to give a research project on the topic early in the term. I've had colleagues do this, and it can be made more engaging by having students research cases in the news. Students seem to be more engaged when hearing about famous people plagiarizing outside of academia. I'm not sure why that is, but I've used articles for discussion on high-profile cases. I won't name names right now, but it takes the focus off academia and the academic crime aspect, and I found that students are much more vocal about the issue then. When it's about intellectual property, they have a lot to say, and you can connect in this way and make it less negative and more exploratory. Finally, you can draw on support from librarians and writing centers if possible. At the New School, our writing center offers workshop on plagiarism, and I can give students credit for attending. That's not possible everywhere. But librarians also have a wealth of experience in this area and do not have to report plagiarism the way an instructor might. They may be able to speak more frankly in some cases, something to consider if you have access to the resources. Okay. I'd like to end with solution 5. I think we need a comprehensive approach to teaching paraphrasing. As we know from the literature and our own classroom observation, paraphrasing presents many challenges for both L1 and L2 students. I would suggest, at a minimum, a 4-step process. First, raising awareness of what paraphrasing is and how it can help avoid plagiarism. Then providing easy-to-understand steps for writing an effective paraphrase. Then having students do noticing activities for paraphrasing. This is a key step in creating a comprehensive approach. Noticing activities are terrific scaffolding for writing practice. Then practicing paraphrasing, of course, and more practice, and more practice, and more practice. I come back to the skill again and again throughout the term. I would say that I cover this in my advanced levels at least 4 times a term, if not more. Here in Final Draft, you can see this 4-step process. Again, a Q&A for an approachable introduction to the topic, then clear, concise guidelines for how to paraphrase, then a noticing activity for looking for errors in paraphrased sentences. You can easily replicate this by providing samples of errors in paraphrased sentences, as is shown here. As an alternative noticing activity, you can use student samples of drafts of paraphrased sentences. I do this each term. You can do this by collecting students' revised paraphrased sentences over the course of a semester or 2, and then use those in future classes. I always do this anonymously, of course, and I ask the student if they don't mind if I use their writing in future classes as a teaching tool anonymously. So you can have your new students notice the way your previous students started out and how they revised their paraphrased sentences. This helps them see how the students resolved problems in their paraphrase revision. So useful, I found. Then, of course, practice. And I would similarly advise that you ask your students to keep their own revisions to reflect on and how they started out and how ended. Okay, some final thoughts on teaching paraphrasing. And mostly a reiteration, because I think that this is one of the most challenging skills that we have to teach in EAP writing classes. So again, regular practice for paraphrasing during the term, it's just too challenging a skill to cover once or twice. 1 or 2 lessons on paraphrasing really won't get students where they need to be. Again, level appropriate or lower text while building foundational skills. And for higher levels, perhaps consider creating awareness around patch writing with activities. That ends the webinar portion before the Q&A here. You have my references if you're interested in reading Moore's concept on patch writing, or if you're interested in seeing some of the other studies that I've read. But now I'd like to hear from you.
Okay, so do we have any questions for Jeanne? We've got I can see we've got one here already from Karen Hodgson, who asks, with reference to your point about challenging texts leading to more instances of plagiarism, is there an argument for recommending students use direct quotation with more challenging texts and try to paraphrase texts that are more accessible to them?
I'm not sure I caught the second part of that, Alistair. I'm sorry. Do you mind just reading the question again?
So, is there an argument for recommending that students use direct quotation with more challenging texts and try to paraphrase texts that are more accessible?
I think there is an argument for that, for sure. But when I'm thinking about my own paraphrasing practice in class, I'm trying to get students to gain mastery over paraphrasing. And so I feel it's important to choose lower level texts so that they can have a moment of mastery. And I think with enough mastery, that can lead students in the future to feel more confident about paraphrasing in general. So while I think it's certainly a strategy to use direct quotation if something is too challenging, especially if perhaps they're in a timed exam context. But for my classroom practice, my goal there is to have students master paraphrasing to the best of their ability. And so I would say that's why I'm choosing the lower level text there. Does that answer the question? Does that help?
Okay, I think so. If you've got another question on that, Karen, if you just type into the chat, that answers it. Excellent. Okay, another question now from Elena Gurdon, who asks, what do you use to detect plagiarism?
Well, at the new school, we have Turnitin as a detection software. And again, I think we've certainly gotten better at detecting. But as you can see, I answered more to the poll question this term. I had 5 instances of plagiarism. I think that may be because I'm teaching a high stakes course. The course that I'm teaching, students have to, they have to get the class, or they may have to repeat it again. And it's a class that they're taking for credit. They're college students, and their grade will be affected. And so as we mentioned earlier, sometimes when courses are more high stakes, there's more instances of plagiarism. I've certainly found that in my experience.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Anna Orridge, which I think is quite interesting. Anna asks, she says that, do you think part of the problem is that students don't quite see the point of paraphrasing, that we quite often get the response, but quotation's so much easier. How do we get students to understand why paraphrasing is worth mastering?
That's a great point. That's an absolutely great point. Yeah, I think it's our job to present the rationale for students. It's our job to let them know that paraphrasing and direct quotation are 2 different ways to have attribution, and that they're expected to work in these ways, that they're not expected to include in an essay in college all paraphrased sentences or all direct quotations. And so I think it's our job to present the rationale for why it's important for them to paraphrase. It's another way that we can bring them into the academic norms, academic conventions. So I think that's an excellent point.
Okay, thanks. Got a question about Turnitin from Victoria Gramp, who says, how reliable do you find it? And do you have any suggestions for other tools that may perhaps be less expensive?
I've noticed that it's actually pretty good, but then there are some cases that have slipped by, and I suspect, with the existence of this technology and students know about it more, you have to put it on your syllabus that you use it. So students are aware of Turnitin, and I think that invites sometimes sort of more, more expert patch writing is maybe one way of saying it. and so I think that there are still some cases that get through. And I can tell just based on writing samples from first day diagnostics to things that they're turning in, and it's been even hard for me to detect, to go in and find. But yet I still know that there's something that is not there. Perhaps a friend helped them with the writing. So I don't think I have a recommendation right offhand of something that's less expensive, but I could certainly find out. I imagine that I could find out pretty easily, and I'm happy to take your email if that's possible, and we could communicate about it.
Okay, thanks. So that okay, so we've got your email address. Just reminding myself who asked that question in the first place, but that was Victoria. Yes, so I will, Victoria, if it's okay with you, I will pass your email address on to Jeanne for that. Thanks. Okay, next question is from Lindsay Simonovitz, who asks, which of the 5 solutions you mentioned do you feel is the most efficient with lower English language level learners?
I think helping them recognize plagiarism, I think bringing them into the academic norms, letting them know that, what plagiarism is. I think starting with the lower levels is really important in a program. I think that if someone enters at an advanced level in a program and they're maybe new to that university, they may only get 1 semester or 2 semesters in that advanced class before they matriculate. That's not enough time to really master the skills you need to avoid plagiarism. So I think starting with the lower levels is extremely important. And I think there are so many things that you can do to start to prepare them to do other more advanced work as they move along. So things like recognizing plagiarism, which I mentioned in one of the solutions, having them just understand what a source is, giving them enough information that they can sort of start to conceptualize what the issue is. So, yeah, go ahead, Esther.
Thanks. I had a question from Kelly Fleming, who pointed out that you mentioned the work done by Moore, but
Hmm.
I think it's not on the bibliography. Could
Oh,
you
it
give us?
should be. It's the one on patch writing. Yeah, there she is. I'm sorry. Did I say Moore? I meant to say Howard. I'm really
Ah, okay.
sorry. It's Rebecca Moore Howard, and I'm calling her Moore, but she's Howard.
Okay,
But you
great.
you see that
Thanks.
she's the third and fourth. You see that she's the third and fourth.
Brilliant. Thank
And
you.
she also has her own blog, and she's written a lot about this. Really interesting. I highly recommend reading those works.
Okay, thanks. I'm just pasting those particular references into the chat there for
Thank
people.
you, Kelly, for flagging that.
Okay, thanks. We've got lots of questions coming, which is brilliant. So, one I was just looking at actually was from Pam Carr-Gibbons, who was asking if you could give a bit more detail, an example perhaps about the research projects you talked about, please. Um, that sounded very
Yeah,
interesting.
I think that starting out the term with a research project, we often start out the term with an academic integrity pledge, and we tell them this is an academic crime, and these are the university's policies, and it's we don't really know how much is sinking in actually, when they read an academic integrity pledge and sign it. And so a research project is one way to ensure that there really is an understanding. It goes way beyond just signing an academic integrity pledge. And what you can do is you can have them research well-known examples. I mean, I didn't want to name names in but they're high-profile cases. There have been many cases. There's a well-known CNN anchor today that has had a plagiarism case in his past, and you can have them you can have them research these famous examples and see what the consequences were and see how that played out. And I just find that students are really interested in it when it's a famous person. That's just something. It's just a way, maybe it takes it out of academia as well, but it's an opportunity for you to bring it in a way that doesn't feel so negative, doesn't feel like it's so directed at the student. Because I feel like we can kind of come in and students can feel a little whelmed with this idea of an academic crime, and I think that this is sort of a more approachable way to get them to research a high profile case outside of academia and come back in class, and in small groups I have them present on their research projects.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. Thank you. Got a question now from Marcy Doherty, who asks if you could recommend any resources for integration practice about helping to train students to integrate source material better into their texts.
Sure. What level are we talking about?
Okay, so Marcy, if you could type into the chat which level you're thinking about, that'd be helpful. Maybe we'll intermediate to advanced level. That's quick, Marcy. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's intermediate to advanced. Are these students are also in college courses? There's the Swales academic writing. It's for graduate students, but there's a lot of really great work on summarizing and paraphrasing, and it might work with your advanced levels. I use it for my undergraduates and graduate students. Um, and I could probably come up with a couple of other things too. Um, Maybe I could also get your email and we could email back and forth. Final Draft Book 4 has uh, avoiding plagiarism unit avoiding plagiarism activity in each unit, and that's really intentional. When I was putting together Final Draft, I pitched the idea of putting it in every unit because I was dealing with it so much in my classes. I just saw that it was not something I could do as kind of a one and done academic integrity pledge thing. So Final Draft Book 4 has a lot of great work there on avoiding plagiarism, including integrating sources.
Brilliant, thanks. Question now from, let's scroll through here. Matthew Devlin, interesting one, on any tips on how to deal with ghostwriting. Matthew finds that students often either deny that someone else wrote it for them, or admit that, and quote marks here, someone helped them to edit it.
Yeah, I deal with this a lot. It's one of those cases where you just know, wow, that doesn't sound quite like that student's voice in other writing, and this is really different. What's going on here? This is a really challenging thing to deal with. I have to say, I'd love to hear people share right now to see if they've done anything that's been successful with this. I think, there is a fine line. We want students to get help with their writing, right? We at the New School, we encourage students to use the Writing Center to have people help them edit their work. We see that as a collaborative process. But I think that might be something slightly different from what Matthew is describing, that someone maybe wrote their entire paper. I think the first approach and things I've done in the past is I sit down with a student and I say that, I wonder if you wrote this because it's really different from the earlier writing I've seen. And I let the conversation go from there. I mean, that's one way to approach it. Anyone else?
Okay,
Deal
so
with someone that's ghostwriting?
we've got a comment from Marvin. It's not a suggestion so much as an observation that ghostwriting's been referred to as contract cheating. So many ghostwritten works escape detection on Turnitin. But, Sophie suggests questioning them on some of the vocabulary and concepts and what they mean.
Can I just go back to Matthew's question a little bit? Because I think, I've just been dealing with this issue so much, and I've been trying to find creative solutions to making sure that I get students turn in their own work so that I can help them improve their writing. And so one of the things that I did last semester is I teach students that are at the Parsons School for Art and Design. And so in my curriculum, I cover a formal analysis paper where they have to do a formal analysis of an artwork. And what I do is I choose 3 or 4 artworks by established artists, but that aren't particularly well known. There's not a lot of critical literature that's been written about them. And I give them the choice that they can look through these 3 or 4 images, and that's the paper that they have to write the formal analysis on. And this is just somewhat related to what Matthew was saying. I found a way in doing that to get them to write their own work. They couldn't go out there and find critical work. And I suppose they could hire someone to do that, but that person would have a hard time too. That person would probably be asking for a lot of extra money because there's not a lot of other things out there written on it. But if you can devise writing activities that ensure that students are doing their own work, I think it's not always possible, but it's just one approach that I take.
Okay, thanks. There's an interesting question from Karen Thomas, who wonders if you could say something about ELL graduate students who've got no prior knowledge of plagiarism. Karen's teaching them for a very short period of time, so they don't have the opportunity of addressing it at the lower level with them because they haven't got them at that point, and they just really haven't got very much time. What would you suggest for that scenario?
Well, I deal with that quite a bit because I teach graduate students at Parsons as well. Parsons is the design school of the New School. And so I'm teaching graduate students this semester, actually. And the scenarios solution that I mentioned earlier, where I give 12 scenarios, that is something that I do with graduate students. And they're all stunned. They say, many of them say, I've been plagiarizing based on their answers. And I found that is really helpful because, for one, they now get a better sense of what plagiarism is. And also, it leaves the door open for conversation. I give these 12 scenarios, and then I have them work in pairs, as I mentioned. And then during the share, I really don't, I let the share go on as long as there are questions. So I never end that activity until all the questions are answered, even if it has to go on for another 15, 20 minutes, because I feel like it's an important thing early in the term to get right with them so that they understand. I also am doing regular paraphrasing. I'm doing a lot of work on attribution. That's something that I do a lot early in the term. The very first assignment in my course, in my graduate course, is a summary assignment. So, and that's by design because, well, they struggle with summary writing, but then there's also the issue of plagiarism. So it's sort of a natural way for me to begin the semester with a foundational writing genre and also the skill of avoiding plagiarism.
Okay, thanks. I've got a lot of people talking in the chat about Google Translate, that they've had the experience of students sharing their own work, writing their own work in their own first language and then
Mm-hmm.
translating it through Google. What's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I've had that quite a bit, and I've had to have a lot of one-on-one meetings with students where I talk about the importance of their own growth and development, and I reiterate to them that I want to help them with their writing, that I'm there. That's what I'm there for. I'm here to support them, and I want to see what they can do, not what can be done through Google Translator. I let them know there's no point in me correcting that. That doesn't make sense, right? The process. I try to help them understand that the process doesn't match with helping them improve their writing. And that one conversation has usually helped for that particular problem. I think they understand after I sit down with them. But as you can see, the conversations and the meetings and the emails and the reports add up, don't they, around this issue? So it's not just did someone plagiarize and it's a definitive case. It's all these other things like Google Translator, and I think it's something we're dealing with on such a regular basis, which is why in final draft I insisted on having activity in each unit so that it's being addressed regularly throughout the term. I wanted teachers to have that as an opportunity if they weren't able to design their own plagiarism activities, that there would be something in every unit that they could use.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question from Kelly who'd like to know more about the note-taking activities. Do you think we've got a little time just to go back to those and have another look
Sure,
at those, please?
sure.
Thanks.
Okay, great. So here in this final draft example, we start out with a Q&A. That's the way each activity in final draft starts out. Again, that's to be approachable. So to sort of introduce the topic, and then steps in effective note-taking, starting out, writing the source dates, names, giving students clear steps for how to take good notes. And then the third section here, analyzing notes, right? There's an original text and then a student sample of notes. Again, this is an approach that's taken throughout Final Draft, and it's an approach that mirrors my own classroom practice. I always want to show students, as much as possible, what I want them to do, right? So here they're going to get a sample that they can pore over, and then there's a time for reflection on how they organize and take their own notes. And then after that, you can give a reading. You can assign a reading and ask students to take careful notes along the lines of what they just saw in this final draft section. And then what I think is very important is to ask them to use those notes for some academic work, right? It's not enough just to say take notes. I think the students are going to not understand why it's important to do that, right? It's got to be connected to some real work they're doing. So perhaps you can ask them to use their notes to do a summary, in an oral summary in a group. Or you can ask them to present their notes to the class. Or you could give them a writing task based on their notes. So I think this process, of taking careful notes will help them avoid the kind of plagiarism that happens when you're doing a research paper. But it also has the side benefit of just asking them to look deeply at a reading, which is something my students struggle with. I find that that's another webinar, Alistair. We have to, because students in the last few years, I think, are really struggling with focusing on reading and understanding the amount of time it takes to read and digest something.
Okay, that sounds an excellent idea for another webinar. I've got a question from Anindita Chaudhary, who picked up on your comment about giving students maybe slightly lower level texts for when they're paraphrasing and summarizing. And Anindita asks where you find material that's an appropriate level that you can trust is going to be the right level for them.
Well, is this the question regarding choosing the right text for paraphrasing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to choose, I know what my student's level is, right? Whatever class I'm teaching, I'm going to choose something that's right at their level, maybe not something that's a little higher than their level, which I might do for reading practice, right? So I'm going to make sure to choose something that I feel like is right, appropriate for their level, or maybe one level down. And that's just, I know my students in my program so well and our leveling, and you probably know your leveling, well as also. You could also use the, Flesch-Kincaid calculator online if you want to determine the text complexity. If you're really wanting to check to see, it'll give you information about the vocabulary and how high it is. It'll give you information about sentence structure, how complex it is. So you could certainly determine it that way, but my goal is whichever level I'm working with, which I know in my program sort of what the level is, I'm going to choose something that's appropriate for them or one level below. Not choosing something that might be a little stretch for them, which I might do in a reading practice activity. Does that help?
Okay. Thanks. So that sounds good. Oh, yeah, if someone could type into the chat the name of the oh, sorry, could you repeat actually, Jeanne, please, the analysis software that was online? The
Oh, right. It's the Flesch-Kincaid. It's the
Kincaid.
Flesch-Kincaid, yeah, readability calculator.
Great, thanks. And I
So
think
so what you can do is you can just cut and paste text into that calculator, and it will give you a grade level, and it will tell you how complex the text is at the level of syntax, its vocabulary, it's a range of things.
okay, brilliant. Thanks, and thanks everybody who's typed that into the chat. That's really helpful. Okay, I think we'll leave that there. So thank you very much, Jeanne, for an absolutely fascinating session. I really wish I'd had this when I was teaching my classes, and yes, I remember some very awkward situations with students who had quite clearly been plagiarizing. So really useful session. I do
Great.
hope we can get you back again. Since you've already suggested another webinar, we'll sign you up again for that.
Absolutely, and I appreciate everyone attending and contributing with questions and throughout the webinar.
Yeah, and actually, very useful comment there by Marcy that on a Word document you can get the level on the Flesch-Kincaid scale by using options proofing.
Yes,
That's really useful to know.
thank you, Marcy. I meant to mention that actually. It is in Word. You don't even have to go online and get it if you have Word. Yeah.
So brilliant. Thank you everybody for contributing. Thanks also to my colleagues Alexis, James, and Caitlin who've been quick
Yes.
on the buzzer there with getting responses into to questions. Question from Pamela: how do we find the recording of the webinar? It'll be on our blog on Wednesday, and I will just type the chat. I will type I can't multitask here. I'm just typing the URL there into the chat box. So that'll be on there by Tuesday. But also, when we send you all your certificate of attendance, that will include a link to the recording, so you can catch up on that if there's anything you want to listen to again. If you want copies of the slides, many of them are on our Twitter account, which I'm also just typing into the chat. Not every slide, I'm afraid, but many of them you can find pictures of them on our Twitter account. So thank you very much, everybody, and we're back next week at Tuesday, 3 p.m. UK time, 10 a.m. Eastern time, for a session on helping teens build the vocabulary they need to express themselves with confidence. And you can sign up for that at the URL I'm just typing into the chat now. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you particularly
great.
to
Thank you.
Jeanne.
Thank you.
And see you all again soon, I hope. Thanks very much.
Terrific.